I've wanted to climb Kilimanjaro since I was like 14. There were a couple of times where it looked like it might happen, especially in 2010 when I met a guy through work who had not only climbed it, but he had led climbs on the mountain. But it didn't happen. Fast forward 9 years, I'm in my 30s, and it's just in my head, it's just this thing that I want to do. I finally have some savings, so I start researching, and I end up booking through this company called Ascend Tanzania. They're a local company based in a town called Mojhi, which is at the base of the mountain. They weren't the cheapest option, but they were on the more affordable side, and one of the main things for me was that they were local, and that all of the money I spent was going to be going to local people and then spread out through the community. Little side note here, even though I'd wanted to do it for more than half my life, when I actually did sign up, I didn't really want to tell anyone, probably because I thought, just in case I didn't make it to the top. But then my parents came to visit me in London about 4 months before the trip, and my mom in a restaurant one night just came out with, "Did you ever think any more about climbing Kilimanjaro?" So I told them. I flew to Dar es Salaam in late January, and from there to Kilimanjaro, and was picked up and brought to Mojhi. Funny thing about being there was when I arrived, most of the mountain was covered in cloud. It was like I wasn't fully allowed to see it until I was on it. I met the group I'd be climbing with, not knowing how many there'd be or where in the world they'd be from. Turned out it was a whole 2 people, Emmy and Will, a father and daughter from London of all places. We met Rama, our main guide, and then he went through all the gear that we were going to be bringing with us. Note for anyone who's thinking of climbing Kilimanjaro, you can rent basically everything you need there in Mojhi, and I'm sure all the other towns that tours go from. But I would recommend bringing your own boots at least. We started our climb on the 2nd of February 2020. There was an absolute downpour that morning. You still couldn't see the mountain. But if anything, that just made me more excited. I'm Irish, I'm basically waterproof. But the rain eased off and turned into more of a light mist by the time we got to Mojhi Gate. The first thing that happens there, though, is the porters weigh absolutely everything that they'll be carrying up the mountain. I'm sure there are ways of climbing Kilimanjaro where you carry all your own gear and tents and stuff, but for the vast majority of people, it's porters who'll be doing all of the heavy lifting. They're limited to carrying 20 kgs each, which means that no one is carrying any excessive weights, but also it means more work for more people. The porters are absolute heroes, and if it wasn't for them, the number of people who actually reach the summit of Kilimanjaro every year would go down from thousands to literally tens. It's that simple. Tip your porters. At precisely sometime after 11, our ascent began. Day 1 was mostly a hike following a path through a forest. The route I chose to do was the 5 nights, 6 days Mojhi route. There are a few different routes up the mountain, and they all take a different amount of time and cater to people with different levels of climbing ability or experience. One of the main things to consider when picking a route is duration. The longer you're on the mountain, the more time you have to acclimatise, which helps prevent altitude sickness. More on that later. The Mojhi route would start at Mojhi Gate and go to Mojhi Camp at just under 3,000 metres. And there we'd have our first experience of camping on the mountain. As well as the general porters, the guys who carry your main bag, tents, chairs, tables, food, water, everything. All while you're going around with your little day bag thinking, oh, this is a bit tougher than I expected on day 1. With each group, there's also a cook who prepares all your meals. And then some groups, like ours, have a designated porter who also acts as a sort of waiter, bringing all your meals to you. Our guy was Omari, possibly the politest man I've ever met in my life, and had like this special knack for getting you to have another bite or two of your food, even when you didn't really want it further up the mountain. He was a good guy. After dinner came a moment that I wasn't really prepared for or expecting, where Rama would check our heart rates and blood oxygen levels using one of those little machines you put on the end of your finger. Now, in our little group, you had Will, who was the eldest, who was early 50s, I believe, and of reasonable fitness. You had Emmy, who was 21 and a swimmer for her university and by far the fittest of the group. And then I was somewhere in the middle, 31, reasonable fitness. I trained for a few months specifically for the climb. I went for long walks and hikes and to the gym, and I was even that guy at the gym with a backpack on my back for a brief period. So I felt confident enough in terms of my fitness. So I was surprised when not only were my stats the worst of our little group, but they bordered on concerning. For a little context, that little machine, if you put that on your finger, your blood oxygen levels should be above 90. Kind of 90 to 100 is kind of normal. When I put it on, it originally said 72. And all I'd been doing was sitting down for the last couple of hours at that point. So then Emmy, who later in 2020 would go on to work in an ICU ward in London with COVID patients, and so knows a little bit about these things, basically banned me from looking at the machine while I was using it, because anytime I'd look at it, my heart rate would go up, my oxygen levels would go down. In the end, my oxygen settled at 84. I don't know if that means I was technically dead, but I went to sleep, and the next morning we got up and kept climbing up the mountain. So this is day 2 in the Chame camp, 2,835 metres. Got here about 3:30 in the day. Yesterday was a good day. Wasn't too much of a slog. A few steep bits, which were harder on the thighs, but generally it was good. It was fine. Chatting most of the way up, so it helps distract from when your thighs are starting to kick in. And yeah, played some cards, had some food, had a sleep. Looking forward to day 2, the hardest day, apparently, so we're told. Machame camp also gave me my first sight of the actual summit of Kilimanjaro, which was, yeah, that was cool. Rama had said a lot of people find day 2 to be the most difficult. I think it's probably the change from day 1 more than anything else. Day 1, like I said, was basically a walk in a forest for the most part, where day 2 suddenly involves some much steeper sections over large rocks. It's not scrambling, but it definitely feels more like you're climbing. You get some incredible views as you come up out of the forest and actually see all around you. Day 2 is also where you start to see more of the mechanics or the logistics of the industry around Kilimanjaro. You see more of the different groups who are on the same route as you, because people generally move out of the camps around the same time in the mornings, and with them you see everyone's porters who are packing up the camps as you leave and then pass you out to set up the next camp before you get there. We climbed to Shira Cave Camp at around 3,800 metres for our second night. Here we got a better sense, again, of just how many people were there climbing at the same time as us, because the campsite was more open and spread out. A kind of amazing thing that happened at Shira Cave was when we got there and we could see the summit, and it looked like this, almost like a different mountain in the distance, and it looked so far away. Like, it looked, whatever about the height of it, it looked like it was days walk to get to the base of that section. But then the next morning it looked totally different. It was like someone had picked up this thing and just moved it closer to us overnight. Day 3, Camp 2, Shira Cave. This place has given us some great views of the Kili summit. Literally just behind the tent. There's the registration hut, and then just behind that, big ridge, big mountain. It's a lot colder last night, but my sleeping bag's great. Alright. Very comfortable. Really? So, quite happy.
apparently today is the day where a lot of people start to feel altitude sickness at the start, because we go from, right now we're at 3,750 metres and we go up to 4,600, stay there for about an hour or so, have lunch, and then come down to 3,900 to sleep. So 4,600, that's going to be where a lot of people start to feel, headaches, nausea, that kind of thing. But he keeps, Rama, our guide, keeps saying, don't worry, that's normal. So hopefully it won't kick in, but even if it does, no need to panic. All good. This is the view out of my tent this morning as well. Can't remember the name of that mountain in the distance, but it looks very cool. That's the kitchen tent. Toilet building, not really worth using if you can avoid it. And our mess tent. The others are off to the right.
It's hard to pick out favourite days on the climb, but I really did enjoy day 3. The landscape changed again from what it had been over the previous 2 days, and even though everyone was still following essentially a path leading the way to the lava tower camp, the whole landscape was much more open. Every now and again you pass these enormous van-sized boulders that have probably been sat in the same place for centuries, from whenever the last eruption in Kilimanjaro was. We stopped at the lava tower camp for lunch, which was basically an acclimatization exercise. It's 4,600 metres, so it's a bit of a jump up from where we'd stayed the night before. So we got there, had what was probably my favourite meal of the whole time on the mountain, had a little power nap, and then headed down to 3,900 metres to Barranco camp. Another little note here, just because I remember it in particular from that day. If you're going to climb Kilimanjaro or just be outside in like any public space ever, don't be that guy or that girl with a speaker. No one's there to listen to your music. Just don't.
Well, this is morning of day 4, the big day, because we have a first something like a 300 metre climb up the Barranco Wall, otherwise known as the breakfast wall, because you have your breakfast and then you go straight up this thing. That should take about 3-4 hours, then a little break, and another 2 or 3 hour march upwards to wherever we're camping, where we'll have dinner and then straight to bed, because tonight at about 11 p.m, somewhere between 11 and 12, we head for the summit. Big day today.
The Barranco Wall was another new challenge. This one was actually more of a case of scrambling, where you use your hands to hold onto rocks or pull yourself up over different points. Only about 300 metres in elevation, but it took a while. But then, of course, once we got up there, the views were even more spectacular. After the break, we then had a longer trek than I think any of the 3 of us expected. It was good fun, and was also the point where conversation started to happen around what food we were going to have when we got back to London. The guy was opting for some sort of Chinese pizza combo. This is where the route changes depending on the duration of your climb. Anyone doing the Mojhi route over 6 nights and 7 days, you've a slightly later start at the Barranco Wall, and then you spend the night at the Caranga camp. But because we were doing 5 nights and 6 days, we had an earlier start at the Barranco Wall, got to Caranga camp, had our lunch, and another very short, maybe 10-minute power nap, and then kept going. This was one of the tougher parts of the climb. The terrain was fine and we were surrounded by cloud for a lot of it, and if anything, this was the part of the climb where it looked like we were most on another planet, which was quite cool. But I'd woken up that morning with a little bit of a headache that I'd hoped would go away after some food, but didn't. That stint brought us up to Barafu camp at 4,600 metres, and weren't we just delighted to be there. From there, the schedule went like this. Try to have a little sleep, which was a struggle. Get up around 5:36 in the evening to have some food, where Omari gave me his politest "are you sure" face, and I had another couple of bites. Then we had another oxygen test. This time mine settled at 80, which I think that time really did mean I was dead. But it was around 8 o'clock at night, and we were told try and get as much rest as you can before we get back up at 11 p.m. I think I got about 40 minutes sleep in that 3-hour window, because turns out even when you're dead you can't sleep up there. And by the way, for anyone who thinks I'm making up these numbers with the oxygen thing, this is my actual form that Rama would fill out every night with my heart rate and what my oxygen levels would eventually settle at. We got up around 11, had some popcorn that the cook made for us, and then I struggled to put in contact lenses using my phone screen and camera as a mirror. There were two noticeable differences before we set off for the summit climb. All along it had been Emmy, Will, Charles, Rama and I in our little climbing group. But now one of the porters, Hamis, who was like gentle giant, just one of the smiliest people I think I've ever seen in my life, really nice guy, he joined us. Basically, when it comes to the summit climb, you need someone, a guide, someone who knows the mountain for every climber. Where all along the two guides that we had could easily have led a much larger group for the actual summit, you need someone for each climber. If for whatever reason one of us needed to turn back, you needed to have a guide with us to bring us back down without then leaving either Rama or Charles to look after two people and try to bring them safely up and back down. So seeing Hamis standing there smiling as part of our little group, that was one of the first things that made it kind of feel quite real that this was the big part. And the other thing that struck me even more was Rama and Charles didn't have backpacks. The whole time they'd had these massive backpacks on their backs, and well, of course it makes sense that they wouldn't need to bring it up and back down from the summit. It just brought it home that where all along they were guides, they were just leading us up the mountain. This felt more like we are here to make sure you get there. If you can't carry your own little small bag, I will do it for you. I'll get you up that mountain. So off we went into the night, leaving the camp around midnight, following the narrow line of head torches that were up ahead of us. I made a conscious decision not to look too far ahead of me. I didn't want to see where people were that I still had to get to. And at the same time, I didn't want to look down at where we'd been. I just didn't think it would help me. So I whenever we took breaks, I found myself trying to sit quite straight and trying to just keep my head level and only look out, and mostly just looked at the stars. Or I did look up at the summit itself. For some reason that was okay to me. I was able to look at the actual summit, but I didn't want to look in the direction that we were having to climb yet. I didn't want it to come into my head where I would start thinking about how long it might take me to get up to where those people are and then those people. It just didn't appeal to me. Now, I mentioned altitude sickness before, and one of the symptoms of altitude sickness, and one of the more dangerous ones, is that you can feel like you're falling asleep. Your body just tells you that it wants to go to sleep, and your eyes start to go. And that was something I was aware of before the climb, and I don't know, probably naively thought that, oh well, I'll look out for that. I'll pay attention, and if I notice that, I'll fight it in some way or something. I don't know. What I hadn't factored in was a long day of climbing, followed by 40 minutes of trying to sleep, and then getting up to start climbing again in the middle of the night when your body just wants to go to sleep. So even though I was relatively awake while we were walking and marching up the side of the mountain, when we'd stop to take a little break, there was a few times where my eyes would just start to close and my head would dip down and I'd basically just nod off. That was actually how I realised that Hamis was originally assigned to look after me, because my head would go and I'd feel his hand on my shoulder and he'd say, "You okay?" And I'd wake up and see him just smiling at me. But the bigger problem was, one of the other main signs of altitude sickness was the headache. The headache I'd had the morning before hadn't gone away, and if anything, it had gotten a little bit worse. It wasn't particularly bad, but it was definitely there, and I wasn't the only one. Emmy had a headache as well, and hers sounded considerably worse than mine. One of the strange things about altitude sickness is just that it affects people differently at different times and in different ways. Emmy's headache was pounding when we were walking, so she needed regular breaks for it to dissipate, whereas for some reason mine was the opposite. When I was walking I was fine, but we'd stop and then mine would kick in and it would be really piercing first and then dull down a bit but still be there, and it wouldn't go away again until I'd started moving again. And it's also worth pointing out that in all this time, Will, the oldest of the group, in his 50s, reasonable fitness, he didn't get a headache once. He didn't feel any symptoms of altitude sickness. I had a headache that was tough but not totally unbearable. And then Emmy, the youngest and by far the fittest of us, seemed to get hit the worst with it. But then at the same time, on any other day, it could have been completely different. Emmy could have skipped up the mountain, Will could have had headaches that annoyed him, and I could have been told, no, you're not allowed to leave this camp, you're not even allowed to try for the summit. You don't know. It as much as you need to be fit, there is an element of lottery to altitude sickness, and pretty much the only way to combat it is duration, how long you spend on the mountain to acclimatise. The answer to our little predicament of Emmy and my headaches getting worse at different times was at one point when we had a break. At the end of the break, I stood up and Rama looked at me and just said, "Go with Charles." And then, partly because of just how tired I was, I probably just said okay, and I just walked with Charles. And it actually took me a minute or two to realise that it was then just the two of us, that Rama had decided to split the group to kind of, so that we could have breaks at different times that would help alleviate my headache and help alleviate Emmy's headache. So that was it. At that point, from there on, it was just me and Charles, and I was just following him, mostly in silence. The sun started to come up, and eventually, at some point, we reached Stella Point, 5,756 metres, and the top of that section of the climb, the last post before the summit. I'd fully woken up at that point, and somewhere along the line, my headache had just gone. I didn't even notice it leave. I just remember getting to Stella Point and thinking, well, this is the highest I've been, and the headache is gone. From Stella Point, it's about an hour and a half to the summit, and as long as your head isn't pounding and your legs are still moving, it is possibly the nicest walk in the world. It's just deep snow around you, and you're just following a path that leads up to a bend, and you know around that bend is the summit. If I had any sort of a profound moment on the climb, it was on that walk before getting to the bend, before I could see the actual summit, because I think whether it was in my head or not, up until then there were always times where something could go wrong, and for some reason I mightn't have been able to make it, or not allowed to keep going. But I think it was once I got to there that I realised, well, now it's just a walk. It's just an hour-long walk with a slight incline, then a bit of a dip, and then another slight incline, and that's it. So I think that's where, if anything hit me about how long I'd been waiting to be there, rather than it be at the summit, it was actually on that walk. And there were a few tears behind the sunglasses, and I'd say I don't think I stopped smiling the whole time. We went around the bend, and there it was, Uhuru Peak, the summit. Maybe a couple 100 metres, and nothing but snow and very happy people in front of it. So we marched over. I gave Charles a bear hug, and he told me the time. 7:14 a.m. on Thursday, the 6th of February, 2020, I reached the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. Took some photos at the sign. Some random English guy told me I wasn't smiling enough, because you get them everywhere. I want to say I was up there for about half an hour, maybe a bit longer. I don't actually know. I wasn't paying too much attention, and all I know is that, a bit like a child, I just kept saying, okay, 2 minutes, every time Charles tried to say we should probably get going again. Also, if you're looking at that, I'm thinking, there's a bit of a mound there behind the sign. Why is no one up on that? I thought the same thing, and I didn't understand it, and no one told me not to, so I went up there, and I'm probably in the background of some people's photos to prove it. There was no way I wasn't going to go to what was clearly the actual highest point, having come all that way. Emmy and Will got to the summit a little after I did. Charles and I were not long just back around the bend, having started our descent when we met them, and by all accounts they pretty much had the summit to themselves while they were there. I trudged back down the mountain with Charles. We passed a few of our porters who gave me fist bumps, and then got back to the camp for more fist bumps and a hug from the cook, and he also gave me the nicest tasting tropical juice drink I've ever had in my life. And then Charles said, I think you need to sleep. And I did, right after I took this photo to commemorate something like 11 hours of climbing. I think I slept for probably 4 or 5 hours at that point, and didn't get up until the others had come back and also had some time to sleep. Then we had some food, packed up our gear again, and started heading down. You head down a shorter way, stopping at Mojhi camp for the night.
Well, that's it. Yeah, summit of Kilimanjaro. This time yesterday, we were up there. I'm tired. The last night was such a good sleep, that was great. And yeah, I'm just packing up now. Something like a 4 or 5 hour walk down to the gate, get picked up by the bus and brought back to the hotel. Probably exit through the gift shop. Tip the porters and the guides. There's Kili. Done.
Mzuri sana wageni wakaribishwa Kilimanjaro, hakuna matata, tembea pole pole, hakuna matata, zuia za majambe, hakuna matata, nashira tukafika, hakuna matata, Barranco tukashuka, hakuna matata, jambo bwana, habari gani?
When we got back to the hotel, the clouds had gone and you could finally see the summit from Mojhi. It felt like a reward. My name's Cian O'Leary, and for 1 week in February 2020, I lived on a mountain.
Umetanua, utanue, chanu, chanu, chanu.